the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson. Later, he's expected on the campus of Columbia University in New York, where pro-Palestinian students have agreed to more talks with the administration. This after a deadline passed for clearing their encampment sitting on the campus. The deadline had been midnight. It's been a tense week in New York City, at Columbia, at New York University downtown, and in other parts where there have been protests. More from our correspondent Jessica Le Mazurier.
Welcome to the People's University for Palestine, reads the sign at the student encampment at Columbia University on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Tent upon tent of students camping out in protest over the war in Gaza. They want the university to divest itself from anything related to Israel. This encampment started on the morning of April 17th. The university called in the NYPD to dismantle it, and multiple people, including 26-year-old master's student Catherine Elias, were arrested. They were quickly released. Catherine's been camping out here ever since.
So, sleeping mat, sleeping bag, pillow, my keffiyeh. Pretty much everything I have at this point was donated by the community because all of my property was also destroyed by the police.
The students here are determined and idealistic.
I think our positionality here as students in the United States, where the United States is one of the largest funders of Israel, one of the largest funders of the genocide happening in Palestine, we sit in the country that not only funds but also manufactures and creates a lot of the bombs dropping in Gaza. Every piece of the weaponry that allows this genocide to continue is being funded actively by universities like Columbia through their endowments. So the student movement today is actually building off of the student movement from the 1960s here in the US and globally, the 1980s against apartheid South Africa, and today we're seeing another spark in the student movement.
But there's some discontent about the encampment. A group of ex-army veterans turned students has gathered on the steps opposite the encampment. Some of these students have Israeli roots.
It seems like the school has lost control of the situation, and nobody really knows what's going to happen. But we're not here to provoke anyone. We saw American flag get burned right outside. A couple of veterans were assaulted, and a couple of my Jewish peers were assaulted, and we're just out here to show we love our country.
Students in the encampment deny there's been anti-Semitism and emphasize that this is a peaceful movement. Free Palestine! Outside the campus, protesters gathered to show support. There's a heavy police presence. The student protesters say they'll keep camping out until their demands are met.
Well, joining us from Nice in the south of France, acclaimed historian Rashid Halidi. He's the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thanks for having me.
Your latest book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. In that report, we saw a campus that you cross every day when you're in New York, and one which hasn't seen this kind of polarization, arguably, since the Vietnam War.
No, in fact, Columbia's campus has always been a scene of student activism. The movement against apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s was animated by Columbia being the first university to divest from South Africa in response to a student movement. The movement for civil rights, other movements have had companion protest movements on the Columbia campus since the Vietnam War. So you're right, the 60s were the time of the highest level of activism. But since then, Columbia has always had a very high degree of student activism around the issues of the day.
Did you ever think that this would be the cause that would bring Columbia to a halt?
I have to admit, I would have been surprised a few years ago to see this level of activism across the country, to see overwhelming majorities of Americans opposing the Biden administration's policies, to see hundreds of trade unions coming out for a permanent ceasefire. But over the past 6 months, it's been 6.5 months now, it's been perfectly clear that American public opinion has shifted significantly. as far as its view of Palestine and Israel, and as far as its view of right and wrong. I think there's a sense that Israel's war on Gaza has caused untold harm, and that American taxpayers are responsible. It's our money that funds this war. It's American weapons that are used to kill so far 34,000 Palestinians, including 13,000 children. And that the moral urgency that involves, I think, has particularly affected young people in the United States.
Affected young people. At the same time, there's this bristling from older generations because of the memory of World War II, because of the fact that it began with October 7th and the Hamas attack and the killing of innocent civilians. Your thoughts on how it's evolved in those 5.5 months, in not just the United States, but also campuses in France, here in Europe?
Well, I think you're right. I think there's a big divide between an older generation and a younger generation. I think the older generation, to be very frank, depends on mainstream media. And mainstream media has tended to echo the government line. And the government line in Western Europe and the United States has been essentially read off an Israeli teleprompter. Whatever the Israeli government is saying, President Biden, his administration, Rishi Sunak and his government and so forth, repeat almost monotonously. Younger people do not pay attention to the mainstream media. They look at alternative media, they look at social media, and they see live-streamed genocide from Gaza. They know better, I think, what's going on, frankly, than the older generation. They have different views, they have different beliefs, perhaps, but they see a reality that, frankly, the mainstream media is protecting older people from seeing. And the second thing that I would say is that it's not just younger people, at least in the United States. Look at the opinion polls. The Biden administration's policy on Gaza is wildly unpopular. The president's position is a minority position, maybe in his age group, people in their 80s or their 70s, but not the majority of Americans in their 30s, 40s, and 50s or across age groups. And I think it's really important to point that out, and to point out the fact also that a lot of what's going on these campuses is being very poorly reported. For example, they say Jewish students feel unsafe. I would argue a very large proportion of the protesters are themselves Jewish. Dozens and dozens and dozens of Jewish faculty members, many of whom remember the Holocaust, many of whom lost relatives in the Holocaust, many of whom teach things like about the Holocaust, have supported the students. So to say Jewish students feel X, Y, or Z, and to assume that represents all of them, is entirely false. I think pro-Israel students feel uncomfortable, and there's some reason for them feeling that way. But I don't think that's true of either Jewish students or Jewish faculty, by and large, on the Columbia campus or on many other campuses.
So why did the president of Columbia University call in the New York City police?
Well, I think she was acting under the pressure that American politicians, particularly from the Republican Party, have been putting on her, as well as pressure that donors and trustees have been putting on her. I mean, let's be frank. The people who govern the United States are mainly in the upper age brackets. They're very conservative, by and large. Even the leadership of the Democratic Party, the president himself, Senator Schumer, and so forth. And they're all very committed to Israel. And that pressure we could see in the congressional hearings, which led to the firing a couple of months ago of 2 presidents of Ivy League universities, and which led to her being forced, or feeling forced, to grovel before this committee, to throw several of my colleagues under the bus, to say and do things that are violations of all kinds of academic protocols, out of a desperate hope that she could escape the kind of fate that two of her colleagues met a couple of months earlier. I think that she called in the police under the same kinds of pressures: political pressures, media pressures, pressures from donors and trustees.
And now we're just a few weeks away from graduation day, and that's a time when a lot of those big donors come to campus. So what's her fate?
Well, I think it's still to be decided. I think that she is going to have to come to terms with the students to some degree. The students are demanding a number of things. And I'm far away from the campus right now. I can't go into details because I'm not familiar with them. But one of the things that they're demanding is that Colombia divest from companies that support a 56-year-old illegal Israeli occupation. In June, it'll be 57 years. Now, this is not a new demand by the students. In 2020, Columbia students overwhelmingly voted in favor of divestment. This has been a continuing demand of large majorities of Columbia students for now 4.5 years. I don't know whether she's going to feel able to accept that or some of the other demands, but I think she's going to have to compromise if she wants these students to leave without having to bring in the police once more. Last time she brought the police in, it worsened the situation. We'll see what happens. I hope that calmer heads will prevail and that the university, instead of using hard-knuckle tactics, will come to terms with what I think represents an overwhelming majority of student opinion and of faculty opinion, for that matter.
Later this Wednesday, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the top Republican in Washington, Mike Johnson, is at Columbia University. Where does this end?
Well, I think one has to look very carefully at a Republican Party led by Donald Trump, who proclaimed that neo-fascists marching under torchlights at the University of Virginia a few years ago were good people, while they chanted, "Jews will not replace us." That's the Republican Party of today. The idea that these people have any concern about anti-Semitism is ridiculous. What they want to do is muzzle and control higher education. They don't like the liberal bent of the students and of many of the faculty. That's their real agenda. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. That is just a cover for a right-wing agenda to do as much as possible to control higher education. They make no bones about it. They're very blunt about it. People like Elise Stefanik, who's led the questioning in that House subcommittee of both President Shafiq and earlier presidents, is herself very close to anti-Semitic groups all over the country. The idea that she cares about Jewish students is absurd. This is a stick to beat higher education with. And I'm sure that the Speaker will be exploiting that to the utmost when he visits Columbia today.
Rashid Halidi, one final question. So you're in France right now, where we're having the same kinds of arguments, meetings canceled, accusations leveled of people supporting Hamas in some cases, politicians, because they've made outspoken statements. Taking a step back, how does it seem here compared to how it seems in the United States?
I mean, I can't speak to politicians in France, but I can speak to the academic situation here in the UK and in Germany, and it's appalling. You have had universities cracking down solely on events involving support for the Palestinians. Support for people who are being subjected to a genocide does not mean people are anti-Semitic. Support for people being subjected to a genocide does not mean that they necessarily support Hamas. It means they don't want their countries, France, Germany, UK, United States, to be complicit in genocide. It's perfectly simple. This is a red herring, whether they support Hamas or they're terrorists or whatever. Most opponents of Israel's war on Gaza simply want Israel to stop slaughtering Palestinians. 34,000 so far, 10,000 under the rubble, probably also dead. Almost 13,000 of those are children. Anybody who doesn't oppose that kind of slaughter, frankly, is lacking a certain moral sense. And your universities, your government, the governments of Western Europe and the United States, frankly, are on the wrong side of history. Long after the Vietnam War, everybody realized, oh, that was a terrible mistake. Your president at the time opposed it. Long after the Iraq War, everybody realized the Iraq War was a mistake. Actually, your president at the time also opposed it. But now, the same people who are supporting this war, that everybody's going to see one day as a horrible, horrible set of war crimes, is blind to that. And I think, frankly, your university administrations are on the wrong side of history. Students should be allowed to organize events which support Palestinians who are being slaughtered in these conditions.
Rashid Halidi, so many thanks for speaking with us from Nice.
Not at all. Thank you for having me.
Stay with us. There's more to come, more news, plus the day's business and sports.